one of the things a writer really looks for is when is the launch party going to be. The last book talk we did a few months ago was about a book about a woman who ran a house of ill fame and her clients were lambs. And tonight's book talk is an attorney whose clients were lambs. I mean, these jokes just kind of write themselves, right? So if you're a writer thinking about doing a book and the lambs are in it, you know the events committee is probably going to say, yes, you can have a book talk at the lambs. But this also speaks to the nature of the book. This was Nathan's club. His clients are on the walls. There's Tom Megan right there, the silent film star. That's Joseph Grismer, who was the shepherd when Nate was a member. All around, this is part of his club. And also, I want to thank a special guest tonight is Nathan's son is with us here too, Nathan Jr. It's always great to have a member of the Lambs family come back to see us after so many years, so welcome. And so, in thinking about what I want to say tonight, I just really wanted to welcome Gary and thank you for writing such a wonderful book. Gary is a practicing attorney, and you can really get a sense of that as you go through the book and find out about all the amazing things and all the incredible names that pop off the page. So please give a big warm welcome to Gary Rosen. Thank you. Take it away. Oh, there's water down there.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Alice and William. I'm inordinately excited to be standing on the stage of the Lambs Club to talk about Nathan Burkan. The many facets of Burkan's life revolved around this club. And he was not just a beloved member of the club, I would say he was a sainted member of the club. And having immersed myself in his life and his whole milieu for a number of years, coming here is, walking in here was like entering a shrine. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. There couldn't be any more appropriate overture to this talk than the music of Victor Herbert. Herbert sponsored Burkan's membership in the club, and the two of them are linked forever in the history of American popular music. When the bust of Victor Herbert was unveiled outside the band shell at Central Park, Mayor Jimmy Walker, another Lamb, said that Victor Herbert would have been a great man even if he had never written a note of music. And he was referring in large part to things that Herbert accomplished with the advice and the counsel of Nathan Burkan. So I'd like, if I can tonight, try to give some idea of how a lawyer of all people could become such a venerated figure at a theatrical club. It was not just because he was a wealthy guy who could be counted on when the club was in financial trouble to come across with a loan and then rip up the IOU. Although the club was almost always in financial trouble, and good old Nate could be counted on for a C note or two. It was not just because he made himself available to help his fellow Lambs get out of their bad contracts, their bad marriages, their bad promises to marry, and their other scrapes with the law, although he did that and often did it for little or no fee, whatever the client could afford. And it wasn't certainly because he was the life of any party. He wasn't. In any social gathering of the Lambs or other theatrical or entertainment people, Burkan tended to fade into the background. And you can see that in this group photograph that's on the table over here. I hope you get a chance to come take a look at it. It's taken outside the U.S. Capitol building in April of 1924, and it's a delegation from ASCAP that Burkan was leading. And it's really the A-listers. And virtually all of those ASCAP members were Lambs. Top names: Victor Herbert, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, John Philip Sousa, Augustus Thomas was there lending them moral support. Really the A-list of Lambs members. And all the Lambs, if you look at them, appear to be having the time of their life. And they're hamming it up for the camera and couldn't seem to be more relaxed. finding Burkhan in the picture is a little bit like playing Where's Waldo. You got to look around, but then you find this guy. And he looks like a man who's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. And he's kind of gamely trying to put on a happy face, but not quite pulling it off. Even Victor Herbert, who died a few weeks later, it has to be said, after he's stricken very suddenly after having lunch at the Lambs Club. Even Victor Herbert looks more in the pink than Burkhan in that picture. Standing next to Herbert in the picture is another Lamb named Gene Buck. He was a Ziegfeld lyricist, and he served as president of ASCAP. And when he eulogized Burkhan, he said, he wasn't a party guy, he wasn't a glad-hander, but he carried himself with a certain nobility. When I look at that picture, and maybe it's from the point of view of a lawyer who knows a thing or two because he's seen a thing or two, I think I see one of the keys to what made Burkhan such an object of devotion amongst his clients. He appears to be a man who's willing, more than willing, to take tremendous burdens off the shoulders of his clients, people who, by their very nature, were not worriers, people who, in the law, would not necessarily be considered men and women of ordinary prudence. And he would take those worries on themselves. They didn't even know they had these worries sometime. And he was suffering vicariously over those things. And so that, I think, was really one of the keys to why he was so loved. And as quiet and unassuming as he was in these social settings, he was a tiger, a force of nature when he got into a courtroom or he got into a legislative chamber and was advocating on behalf of his clients. Their cause became his cause, even if they didn't even know what their cause was. On that particular occasion in 1924, they were there to oppose the passage of something called the Free Radio Music Bill. And what it would have done was give the radio industry, which was in its infancy, an exemption from paying for the use of copyrighted music, which is what made up the great bulk of its broadcast days already at that early stage. The broadcasters were using many of the same arguments we hear today from new media. The music people should be thrilled that we are giving their music free advertising. We can't make a profit if we have to pay for music. If you force us to pay for music, you're going to snuff out our world-changing technology in its incipiency. Very similar things to what you'll hear today from screamers and so forth. And it was also something of a David and Goliath battle. Although broadcasting was new and nobody had figured out how to run commercials and make money from broadcasts yet, broadcasting was backed by the biggest industrial corporations, people like General Electric, Western Union, and AT&T. They were hoping to get cheap content that would drive demand for the equipment and services that they wanted to sell in support of broadcasting. On the other side, the music people was a couple of hundred songwriters and maybe a few dozen mom and pop music publishers. So it wasn't necessarily a fair fight. And if that law had passed, the last 100 years of the American music business would have been quite different. The lives and careers of the men in that picture would have been quite different. The lives of their heirs would have been quite different. We wouldn't be here 100 years later reading in the paper almost every week about another eye-popping 8 or 9 figure song catalog deal if that law had passed and that precedent had been set. The value of songwriting copyrights would be nothing like what it is today. But they did prevail. Burkhan orchestrated a brilliant presentation in front of a Senate committee. He arranged for his clients to give a concert to the members of Congress the night before. They were brought to tears hearing all these old sentimental ballads and stuff. Wait Till the Sun Shines, Nellie, and that kind of thing. Brought a lot of goodwill. And so, not for the first time and not for the last time, Burkhan's gravitas paid big dividends for his less gravitas-worthy clients. Before Burkhan came along, judges and legislators, people educated in the Victorian era, treated entertainers as members of a dissolute profession, and their cases were treated as jokes. Burkhan was really a key figure in changing that, and that's a big piece of why he was so loved. For 35 years, Burkhan was always the calm in the middle of a storm, the ringmaster of a three-ring circus, the designated driver at the frat party. You can choose the metaphor of your choice. But there was always insanity going on around him. There was one brief period in 1927 where by day he was representing the prime minister of the underworld, Frank Costello, in a conspiracy trial in federal court arising from his running activities during Prohibition. And Burkhan was using that trial as a forum to expose rampant corruption in the Coast Guard and in the other arms of Prohibition enforcement. By night, Burkhan was dealing with a high-maintenance, unexpected house guest, Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin, apparently carrying suitcases full of cash, had hightailed it from California, where his second wife was trying to serve him with divorce papers, and her lawyers and the Internal Revenue Service were competing with each other to seize Chaplin's assets. Both matters, for weeks, dominated national headlines, and Burkhan was juggling them and he was besieged by reporters day and night. But both these men, Costello and Chaplin, survived those particular legal ordeals, and Burkhan had handled the public relations aspect of it so masterfully that this crook and this heel were widely viewed as victims. It was around that time that a syndicated columnist dubbed Burkhan New York's spotlight lawyer. And he wrote that one or two newspaper writers can always be found milling about for any crumbs that may be picked up from under Burkhan's polished mahogany desk. He was very popular with the reporters in the New York tabloids. And I don't think it's a coincidence that after Burkhan passed away, we went from having 12 major dailies in New York down to 3 now, because they didn't have him as a source anymore. Another aspect of the Burkhan mystique that you should understand was a remarkable ability to gain the mutual trust of natural antagonists. He'd represent a songwriter and the songwriter's publisher. He'd represent an actress and the actress's producer. He'd represent a film director and the director's movie studio. That gift of diplomacy was absolutely critical in forming ASCAP. So just to take a step back, the idea behind ASCAP was that songwriters of all stripes and music publishers would pool their copyright interests, license this entire enormous body of musical works as a whole to commercial music users, and then they would distribute the proceeds amongst the members. And as simple as that is in concept, it was very difficult in reality to pull off. Music publishers in particular had to be pulled into that kicking and screaming, because this really upended the business model that they had always followed. For them, the money had been in selling sheet music to amateur musicians. Then they paid for professional commercial performances of their music as advertising, plugs. ASCAP was kind of proposing to reverse the traditional money flow. a big, big change. Even non-theatrical songwriters who depended on vaudeville to disseminate their music were wary of this idea. The only people who were all in on it were the theatrical songwriters. And that's why the Lambs have such an outsized role in the creation of ASCAP, because that's where the theatrical songwriters, Victor Herbert, Raymond Hubble, and others were situated. They loved the idea of ASCAP, and they were the ones pushing it, 6 out of the 9 founders. The other founders were Burkan and I think 2 music publishers. So they were really the only songwriters at the beginning there. And it took a lot of compromises over the first 20 years of ASCAP's existence to hold these groups together. But Burkan was the perfect guy to do that because he was everybody's lawyer. He represented everybody. Everybody trusted him. So he pulled it off. We have some lawyers in the audience today. They may be thinking, well, what about conflicts of interest? And I think Burkan's reply would have been, what about him? His law practice, was a hornet's nest of conflicts of interest, things that would make a present-day lawyer's head explode. So inconceivable now. Film Daily once joked that when Nathan Burkan walks into court, he finds that he's the opposing attorney. That presumably is an exaggeration, but I do know there was at least one case where he was representing Al Jolson. It was a contract dispute with D.W. Griffith, and Burkan, in front of a jury, took the stand as his own witness. Later that became a Woody Allen bit. It's just not something that could be done today. But there was a different set of rules in force, and especially a different set of rules for Burkan, who had so much goodwill built up, not only among his client base, but amongst the judges in New York and so forth. Another Lamb, the film director Henry King, told what I think is the best Nathan Burkan conflict of interest story. King was a Burkan client, as was the film producer Sam Goldwyn. Goldwyn was pursuing King for a project. King was leery of working with Goldwyn, who didn't have the best reputation. Burkan brought his 2 clients together in the lobby of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and as King told the story, Nathan turned to me. This was in Goldwyn's presence, and said, "Look, Henry, this man will carry out to the letter every word there is in a contract he signs. But don't believe anything he tells you or promises you that isn't in writing." Sam almost tore the hotel down. "Nay," he cried, "you're my attorney." Nathan said, "But I'm also Henry's attorney, and I'm telling the both of you the truth." Burkan then wrote out the contract in longhand on Ambassador Hotel stationery, and it was the contract for Stella Dallas, which was a big success for both King and Sam Goldwyn. Burkan was as ubiquitous in the film industry, as omnipresent as he was in music and in theater. His most famous film client, by definition, was Charlie Chaplin. He was the most famous man in the world at the time. When Burkan started representing Chaplin in 1916, Chaplin was a studio employee, earning about $5,000 a month, and had no creative control over his output. Within a few years, Chaplin was a studio owner, and he controlled copyrights, which continued to enrich his progeny to this day. And he was very much the envy of all of Hollywood. Any biopic you see set in that era, at some point or another, there's the actor being featured complains, "Chaplin owns his own properties. Why am I such a schnook?" But it was Burkan who brought him to that position. And they were close friends, not just because he could crash at Burkan's apartment when he was eluding his wives, which he did twice, 2 different wives. There's a picture over there taken at the Chaplin studio with Chaplin in the center and Burkhan on one side in the hat, and Chaplin's good friend Douglas Fairbanks on the other side. Chaplin wrote in one of his memoirs, "I love Nate, but I'm afraid of him. His pockets always bulge contracts." And if you look at this picture, you will see in the outer breast pocket of Burkhan's beautifully tailored suit his ever-present monogrammed fountain pen, a sibling of which I have here tonight. And you can see the buttons of his jacket are bursting as if the Incredible Hulk is about to emerge. And on my close analysis of that picture, the problem with the fit is that his inner pockets are indeed stuffed with papers, presumably stuff to scare Charlie Chaplin with. So every superhero has an origin story, even the Incredible Hulk of lawyers. Burkhan's origin story was something of a surprise to me. He wasn't, as I had assumed, a frustrated performer living vicariously through his glamorous clients. As far as I can tell, as a young man, he wasn't even much of a fan of the performing arts, except maybe burlesque. If he had ever seen a Victor Herbert show before becoming Victor Herbert's attorney, I'd be very surprised. He came to the entertainment world through his first love, which was politics. As a young immigrant boy on the Lower East Side, family came from Romania, he came under the wing of Tammany Hall, which in addition to being a famously corrupt political machine, was also a provider of social services for the poor at a time when the government didn't do very much of that. And it was a very powerful engine of upward social mobility for talented but underprivileged young men and women, such as Burkhan. He remained a loyal Tammany man all his life. He became a district leader up in East Harlem. He was always associated with the progressive wing of Tammany Hall. People like the future governor Al Smith, the future mayor Jimmy Walker, and the future U.S. Senator Robert Wagner. In 1915, he was a delegate to a constitutional convention in New York State. And there, he was one of the leading opponents of a provision that would have imposed literacy tests for voters, and another provision that would have basically prevented the legislature from ever passing social welfare legislation. He took that regard and love and care for the little guy and the underdog from the political world to the entertainment world. And Alice has told the next part of the story better than I can. When Burkhan graduated from NYU Law School at the age of 20, he was too young to take the bar exam. He had to take a job with Julius Lehman, who was a good Tammany man. That was the connection, as a clerk until he was ready to take the bar exam. And Lehman was like a lot of ethnic lawyers at that time. He had to live off the work that the white shoe WASP law firms wouldn't do, the disreputable stuff, and that included theatrical clientele, including, in Lehman's case, Victor Herbert. As Alice told you, Herbert was defamed in the Musical Courier magazine, a over-the-top type of criticism. It wasn't a difficult libel case, but it was an important libel case. And just a few things I'd add to Alice's account. She mentioned that in the classical world, they weren't happy that Herbert was leading a brass band. They probably weren't, I don't think they were happy about what he was doing on Broadway in particular either. Crossover wasn't a thing then. Herbert was inventing crossover right then and there as it went along. So nobody recognized it as a legitimate thing at the time. And that's where a lot of that criticism came from. Alice mentioned the verdict in the case. I think it would translate, or the final judgment that was collected translated to about $150,000 in present-day dollars. What had really been important to Victor Herbert was he saw it as a vindication of his artistic credibility. And he had, to mollify the classical critics, he had taken time away from Broadway while he was conducting the Pittsburgh Symphony. But after that verdict, he felt liberated to do whatever the hell he wanted. And he came back to Broadway with a vengeance. I can't see anybody. Is Alice somewhere? Yeah. I mean, he came back with a vengeance in 1902, 1903, 1904, and was doing 2, 3, maybe even 4 shows a year.
Yes.
Even 4. And that included some of his biggest hits, including one of his most hit-filled shows, Mademoiselle Modiste, which I understand, Alice, is your next production coming up?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
April 26th and 27th.
All right, thank you. You picked up that cue very nicely, thank you. No rehearsal. So in any event, that's the origin story. The rest was history. He and Herbert went on to have victory after victory. They won the right for songwriters to get royalties for mechanical recordings of their music. Before that, records and piano rolls didn't pay. They formed ASCAP together, and then they won the landmark Supreme Court case of Victor Herbert versus the Shanley Cabaret, which established that a commercial business that uses music, even if it's incidental to its main line of business, it's a fashion store that plays music over the loudspeaker, even then, it's subject to a royalty obligation. Vastly important decision written by Oliver Wendell Holmes. You may have heard the story. One day, Victor Herbert, and in some versions of the story, he was with his friends Puccini, and Herbert and Puccini walk into a cabaret. It's like the setup to a joke. They hear one of Victor Herbert's songs being played, and Puccini says to Herbert, Victor, they have to pay you for that. And Victor says, in the United States, they don't have to pay you for that. And Puccini said that's an outrage, and that was the origin of ASCAP. I don't want to disabuse anybody of a nice story, but none of that happened. Herbert and Puccini never went into the cabaret together. The jacket flap of my book says, I tell stories of dramatic and uproarious courtroom confrontations. And as you know, you can't say something on the jacket flap that isn't 100% true. So I want to tell a story about a case that was equal parts Oscar Wilde and Monty Python. The case of the People versus Mae West. As you may know, early in her career, Mae West had been convicted of, under a stage censorship law, and sentenced to spend 10 days in a workhouse on Welfare Island. And Mae West took this as a publicity bonanza. She had a reporter interviewing her every day at the workhouse. It launched her career to new heights. Her next show on Broadway was Diamond Lil, which was her biggest hit, something she came back to New York decade after decade and revived. It's really the show that solidified the iconic Mae West, wisecracking, sex-pot persona. I think it was the first time she performed some of the bawdy songs she became known for. And it was a big success, and that was a big thumb in the eye of the Society for the Suppression of Vice. And they started lobbying for a stricter stage censorship law, something that would have some teeth in it, and people couldn't just go on to even bigger and smuttier shows. Governor Al Smith, who was planning a presidential campaign at the time, was happy to oblige, and he signed into law in 1927 what was called the Wales Padlock Act. And the Wales Padlock Act allowed the police, upon their determination that any part of a play was indecent, that is, would tend to corrupt the morals of a theatergoer, the police could come in, arrest the entire cast and crew, padlock the theater, and then, if there was a conviction down the road, there'd be stiff penitentiary time, none of this 10 days on Welfare Island kind of thing. That law gets passed, and I think you could summarize Mae West's response to it in the phrase, "Fellas, hold my beer." While she was still appearing as Diamond Lil, she wrote and directed another play called The Pleasure Man. And The Pleasure Man had had some tryouts in the outer boroughs, and by the time it opened on Broadway in October 1928, it was already notorious. The police raided the third performance at midway through, arrested the entire cast and crew, brought them down in the paddy wagon, padlocked the theater, went over to the theater where Mae West was appearing and dragged her out of her dressing room. But that was not before the show had received what I would consider possibly the worst critical notice in the history of the legitimate Broadway theater. I have to get this right. And you have to try to imagine this plastered on a theater marquee. Post writes, "Pleasure Man is smeared from beginning to end with such filth as cannot possibly be described in print, such filth as turns one's stomach even to remember." I don't know how you would put a positive spin on that one. The PR experts can puzzle over that. The plot of The Pleasure Man involved an itinerant actor, the Pleasure Man, who goes from city to city defiling young women. And until he eventually gets his comeuppance, and he dies when the brother of one of his conquests botches an unspecified surgical procedure, which the brother announces at the final curtain was not intended to kill him, but merely to ensure he could never again use women for his selfish, rotten pleasure. The man who played the actor who played the Pleasure Man later testified under oath he had no idea what that surgical procedure was. That plot was not the problem. The police didn't object to the plot as Mae West insisted it had an important moral lesson for young men. The problem was that the theatrical troupe the Pleasure Man traveled with was filled with stock burlesque characters, including especially a bevy of flamboyant female impersonators. They minced, they whoopsied, and what the police seemed to find most objectionable, in their spare time they sewed lampshades. According to the district attorney, they gave every appearance of being male degenerates by actions and voice. And there was a team of acrobats who tumbled in a manner that allowed the head and shoulders of one to disappear inside the prop trousers of the other, to a point approximately where the private parts would be located. This is from the court papers. To a point approximately where the private parts would be located, moving his head about in the vicinity of the private parts. Burkan managed to delay the trial in the case for about 1.5 years, which was important because he and West had made sure that every copy of the script had disappeared before the police could ever get their hands on it. So when the case came to trial, there were numerous disputes about what had actually been said, what had actually been sung. Did the character who said, "I perform on my knees," add or not add the innocent explanation, "I'm a mammy singer"? In the song, "I am queen of the beaches," was the last word pronounced to rhyme with peaches or ditches? Not having a script, the police had to rely upon a cop, the aptly named Officer Coy, who had sat through the various performances and testified to what he heard and saw. Let's just say Officer Coy turned out to not exactly be Brooks Atkinson when it came to being a theater critic. The prosecutors had wanted to make some points with an exchange where one female impersonator asks another, did you ever have a platonic love affair? And the other responds, yes, but then his wife found out. Coy testified that the setup line was, did you ever have a chronic love affair? Which both spoiled the joke and the legal argument that it was indecent. One of the novel features of the case was that the prosecution brought in the first ever expert on double entendres. This was a guy, I think, from the police vice squad, who was going to come in and explain to the jury that certain words in the dialogue had a coded meaning that male degenerates would understand. Burkhan objected strenuously to this, and I think he had the better argument. He said, look, if the jury needs a translator to know that these lines are dirty, it's not likely to corrupt the morals of the average theater goer. But nonetheless, the judge allowed the sexpert, as the press called him, to testify. And he explained what the words horse and moon meant in the lyric, officer, let me pat your horse. Isn't it coarse? My, hasn't it grown since June? Get out and get under the moon. The closing statement that Burkhan gave in the case was a jeremiad against the dangers of what he called nightstick censorship. That is, permitting the police, on their own determination of indecency, to shut down a show and then provide due process later, if ever. Pleasure Man was never able to reopen, and I suspect most shows that gotten that kind of treatment probably never would have been able to reopen. Burkhan asked, who were the police to decide that scenes of men sewing lampshades were unfit for the theater? Why, he said, I know a policeman who makes beaded bags in his spare time. It is no crime as yet, he argued, for a man to be effeminate and to have a falsetto voice. The case ended with a hung jury, 11-1 in favor of conviction. Mae West declared victory again and went out to Hollywood and became one of its biggest box office draws. The Wells padlock law stayed on the books, I think, into the 1970s, but this case had been such a fiasco, which is exactly what Burkhan had intended to be, that the law, nobody wanted to enforce it anymore. And for his trouble, Burkhan was stiffed by Mae West for most of the fee that they had agreed upon, $9,000 out of $14,000. There's an urban legend that that fee bankrupted Mae West. I don't see any evidence of that. By the time he started pursuing her for it, she was already a big, big Hollywood star. I have one more picture somewhere here I wanted to share. 35 years of vicarious suffering on behalf of his clients took a toll on Burkhan. This, and I'll leave it out somewhere where you can look at it. This is him at the ripe old age of 56, looking easily 20 years older. It's 1 year before he died at the ripe old age of 57. The boy on the arm of his chair was not a grandchild, but his son, Nathan Jr. I am so happy, and he hasn't changed a bit, that Nathan Jr. is here with us tonight. Thank you. When I started the book, Nathan Sr. had already been dead for 80 years, nearly. I only identified 2 living people who would have known him. One was Nathan Jr., who was 5 when Nathan Sr. died, but Nathan Jr. has given me all the help he possibly could have, including gifting me the holy relic of the fountain pen, and I'm so grateful for that. The other was a woman who had actually been cross-examined in court by Burkhan when she was 10 years old. But she was working on a book of her own with her son, Anderson Cooper. Now, I had to do it without her cooperation, without Anderson Cooper's help. But I assure you, it is dramatic, it is uproarious, and it is a damn sight more accurate than what Gloria and Anderson wrote in their book. So please, if you're interested at all, the book will be for sale here. I am so grateful for you all coming out here. I'm grateful to the BA2 variant for allowing us all to come out here. Please stay the hell away. And I gather we have a question and answer time.
Any questions?
Anything, I can't see it. I've got a light in front of me.
I'll ask the first one. How
Okay,
did come to
you're the
subject?
chairman. I'm sorry?
How did you come to the subject?
How did I come to the subject? Like a lot of lawyers, I first heard of him when I was a law student, because as a memorial to him, ASCAP created a writing competition where people would write stories about copyright law, write articles about copyright law, scholarly type articles about copyright law. Each school had its own competition. The winners would go to a national competition that was judged by some of Burkhand's proteges at ASCAP in the early years. And then they would get published in a journal, the national winners. And several of the greatest copyright scholars of the 20th century started out winning that contest. I didn't even enter, I'm sorry. Just wasn't ambitious. So in any event, that's how I first heard of him. I then started doing intellectual property law, including music copyright cases. And I'd see his name again and again and again. And each time, some little anecdote. He represented Al Jolson in the jazz case matters involving the jazz singer. He represented little Gloria Vanderbilt. I saw the movie Little Gloria, Happy at Last, where he's played by Martin Balsam. Not bad, not bad. I don't believe he ever wore a cardigan sweater in the office, but otherwise I think Balsam had him right. But there was just, as I was seeing him again and again in my work and another reading, and I felt there was a book, there was a story that had never been put together. You'd see little bits and pieces of it, and I'm sure publishers have asked you this question: why are you the right person to write that book? Like, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do this. And I'm well qualified, so I felt I had the answer to why are you the right person to do this book? And it was really a pleasure. It really was. I enjoyed going back in time. It's scary sometimes with all the morbidity and mortality of these people. Nate Julius Lehman dies of an ear abscess at 57. Victor Herbert drops dead after lunch. Nathan Burkhan dies at 50. It gets a little depressing after a while, and the diagnoses are sometimes pretty funky. But it's a lot of fun, and I've always enjoyed the music and the movies of that era, so it was a natural. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, I got two questions. The first is, did Mr. Burkhan was he ever associated with any of Buster Keaton's lawsuits, either with him or the ex-wives or anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. The other question is, and I'm not a lawyer, this might be a really dumb question, but with the Mae West situation, wasn't this a First Amendment situation? I mean,
First Amendment.
yeah, I mean, why should anything be censored just because they don't like it?
Did you know the First Amendment didn't always apply to the states? And this was
No,
a state
why?
proceeding. I have an expert here who can tell me when it was applied to the states. I'm looking at you, Mike.
Repeat the question. Okay, repeat the question.
I don't know the date of the incorporation.
Okay, but
In addition, the First Amendment wouldn't cover obscenity.
that's true too. That ultimately, there's certain things that are outside the scope of freedom of speech: child pornography, obscenity, fighting words, and so forth. Thank you, Judge Kiesel. I didn't think there was going to be any law here tonight. Anything else?
How long did you work on this book?
How long? 6 years directly, although I had a day job. And it was an outgrowth from an earlier book, so that was another 6 or 7 years. I wouldn't tag that whole period of it, but some of it. So I tend to think of the two books as having been a 15-year project. And I think that's the way my wife here, my long-suffering wife, thinks of it. It was 15 years.
It seemed longer.
Even longer. It was only 15 years, I'm happy to say.
So what's the other book?
The other book is called Unfair to Genius, and it's about a prolific copyright litigant, a man who believed that Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Harry Warren, and many of the other authors of the Great American Songbook had stolen their music from him. Literally stolen their music. He brought a case against Cole Porter and had the chance, he didn't have a lawyer at that point, he had a chance to take Cole Porter's testimony, and he spent the whole time trying to get Cole Porter to admit that he had sent stooges to this guy's apartment to rifle through his files and steal his music, which became some of Cole Porter's greatest hits. So that was the first book. And writing a book about somebody who's kind of an anti-hero, I felt like as an antidote to that, I needed to write a book about somebody genuinely a hero. So that's what it was. Yes?
What's the next book?
I may be aging out of this process. I have an unfinished outline of something on that I call a biography of the Great American Songbook, but I'm just not committed to it yet. And boy, it takes a commitment to do this. Any of the writers here know what I'm talking about, but it may yet happen. It's like giving birth. It takes a little while to forget the pain and do it again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.